Hey, good evening. Welcome to Foreigner in the Philippines. Well, along with the promise that we would look at a few different kinds of subject matter when I do my late night meanderings, this is not so much meandering as the fact that I try to read a lot. I don't get as much chance to read as I would like, but some of the books that I've read, certainly just as I was leaving Florida, I read a very interesting book, and it was entitled Who Built the Moon? And if you start looking at information and data about the moon, our beloved moon, then you quickly realize that it's not quite what you think it is. The most that I ever knew about the moon when I was a kid was the man in the moon, and that it was made of cheese. Of course, we all know that that's absolutely true, don't we? Though NASA has failed to communicate this fact. Anyway, seriously, I'm just looking at a chapter here in a book that was written by a man called Dr. Noel Huntley. And the chapter is called Our Enigmatic Moon. And I would like to read from this book. I've chopped out some of the phrases that I think are the most understandable in terms of what we know about the moon already, even as a bystander, as a layman. I'm not an astronomer, nor am I into all of the things about astronomy which are fascinating to some other people. Excuse me. But anyway, it's been established that the moon is not quite what we think it is. And who has established that? Well, for those of you who are waiting for scientific evidence, perhaps you will look to NASA for some of the reports that they've made. And as I say, I've edited out a few here. I've outlined a few that we might be able to see. It says, so thus our neighbour is the biggest enigma in current astronomy. But it's not generally admitted by the professionals, not generally admitted. In other words, we get really fed a load of palatable mush in what I think. So we're not allowed to know a great deal of things. We're not allowed to know which politician is telling the truth and which politician is telling a lie. So what are we going to know about the moon? Anyway, it says, let's outline some of the extraordinary anomalies and mysteries surrounding the moon. Clearly not all data will be equally reliable, but the abundance of interrelated information nevertheless gives an overall picture which can be determined with some certainty. So what's happening here is that the author is providing us with an overall view about some of the things that have been claimed about the moon from various organizations, and like NASA, and various scientists, two Soviet scientists that he mentions here, Vasin and Shcherbakov. I'm not very good on the Russian pronunciation, okay? You have to forgive me for that one. But anyway, apparently those two scientists have spent much of their careers examining the facts compiled on lunar phenomena, and we'll get to those in a second, right? But it says, so the abundance of interrelated information nevertheless gives a good overall picture. The first academic enigma must surely be that the moon is apparently in its wrong orbit for its size. Now, Carl Sagan, depending on where you come from, in England they call him Sagan, but in America I don't know how they work this one out, but they call him Sagan. So anyway, good old Carl S. is a very eminent scientist and something of a futuristic scientist as well, in putting forward some things, pieces of information which aren't generally accepted. In fact, he predicts things. But he made the claim. He said, this is the statement that Carl made. A natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. But meaning here that if it is hollow, it is not a normal natural satellite, and therefore artificial. Now, what's the information that we have of that preposterous idea that the moon is hollow? Is that a whole lot better than saying the moon's made of cheese? On first look, it's not. But anyway, it says, however, this would presumably be based on its assumed density. Now, what that means is that if it was indeed a solid satellite, which it would have to be a satellite, if it was a solid body, then it would be in the right orbit. But the information that we have from august bodies like NASA, who have noticed strange things that happen with the moon, it would seem that it's not a solid body. So astronomy data indicates, well, let me see, technical reports claim a density of 3.3 for the moon compared to 5.5 for Earth. Astronomy data indicates that the internal regions of the moon are less dense than the outer, giving rise to the inevitable but unconventional and outrageous speculation that it could be hollow. Why would we think it's hollow? Well, they're able to gauge the density of something with their technical scientific equipment, and I'll hope to be able to support what I just said in a moment. But anyway, the eminent scientist Carl Sagan, a typical skeptic, made the statement, a natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. It must be solid, so therefore the moon is not a natural satellite, and apart from that, it's apparently in its wrong orbit for its size. So, possibly the strongest evidence for it to be a hollow object comes from the fact, and get this really surprised me when I read this, that when meteors strike the moon, it rings like a bell. Now, would you believe that that was true? If I said, oh yeah, well, you know, when one of those meteor thingies hits the moon, it goes bong, bong, and you quite rightly would say he's gone off his rocker again, as I often do. Anyway, when the meteors strike the moon, it rings like a bell. Now, listen to this. More specifically, when the Apollo crew in November 20th, 1969, discarded the lunar module after returning to the orbiter, the module impact with the moon caused their seismic equipment to register a continuous reverberation like a bell for more than an hour. I thought that was pretty interesting. The same effect occurred with Apollo 13's third stage. It caused the moon to ring for over 3 hours. The moon is ringing. Don't answer that phone, of course. So what's going on with the moon? Also, NASA has lists of records of meteor impacts giving the length of time the moon subsequently reverberated, ranging in hours. I thought that was pretty amazing. So, two Soviet scientists, Vasin and Shcherbakov, have spent much of their careers examining the facts compiled on lunar phenomena, as I already said. Their conclusion is that the moon is artificial, possibly a hollowed-out planet, and that it was steered from some distant region of the galaxy into a circular orbit around our planet. Hence the extraordinary mystery of inconsistent variations in age evaluations of rock and moon dust. Because obviously they brought this stuff back and then they test it, and they have apparently quite accurate ways of deciding what the age of a piece of material is. So they claim that intellectual life has existed in the moon for aeons. Now you might have a bit of difficulty chewing on that one, I have to admit. In 1968, and now I'm getting into the strange stuff, which you may or may... Oh, I don't believe that. Oh, about UFOs now. Oh, God. In 1968, as Apollo 8 moved into orbit around the moon, the astronauts spotted a colossal extraterrestrial object, which then had disappeared the next orbit. So they're going around and they see something and go, oh my God, what's that? Let's have a look at that when we go around again. And then when they go around again, say, hey, it's gone. I wonder what happened to it. See, now, what happens with this is that photographs were taken, but they're not released to the public. And I'm not even going to go into that whole thing about whether they really made a landing on the moon, whether they really made it. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on that, isn't there? Well, the flag was fluttering in the breeze, so perhaps it was the air conditioning in that huge factory that they did the faking of the Apollo and all of that. So we won't go into that. But anyway, another occasion from the lunar excursion module was down to 4.4 to 5 miles from the moon's surface. Astronauts witnessed a UFO suddenly rise from a crater and rapidly disappear. On a separate occasion, in 1969, Aldrin was checking the lunar surface from orbit when two UFOs appeared, moved towards the Apollo rocket, hovered nearby. Then, to Aldrin's utter astonishment, the UFOs joined to form one entity. It gets very, very strange. Let's just look at some of the people that have stood up and put their considerable reputation at risk by standing up and making statements which support this impossible idea of the moon having intelligent life. Renowned astronomer Patrick Moore. Now, Sir Patrick Moore in the UK is an extremely well-known, well-respected astronomer. You see him often on television. He's a voice. Now, Patrick Moore discovered over 100 dome-like buildings. In fact, about 1,000 such bases, dome-like structures of diameter around 700 feet, have been witnessed. Now, this is interesting. Look, we've only been going to the moon for a relatively short time, but astronomy records have existed extending back 200 years that indicate no such artifacts until about 1950. So they've suddenly started to appear. Now, does that mean that we never noticed them? Does it mean that our telescopes are better? Does it mean an awful lot of things? Well, 1950s, that was a little bit before we even started thinking about well, we were working on it, but that was when we started the plans, probably, for getting to the moon. So, many of the UFO encounters by the astronauts were stated to be of a positive nature in which unintrusive assistance was given. So anyway, what else? It's been found that asteroids and meteors not only create shallow craters craters on the moon's surface, but the large ones produce a convex floor. So once you go into, remember that the moon is not as big as the Earth, so the curvature of that body is much more acute than on planet Earth. So it's saying that the large ones actually have a convex floor. So in other words, rather than a hollow, which you would get from a body striking something else, it's not that way, because it can only strike a certain amount, and then it reaches the actual shape of the planet itself. Planet, body, heavenly body. Okay, so it has a convex floor to the crater instead of a convex as expected, supporting the idea of a rigid underlying shell. Countless other pieces of evidence from astronomers and NASA scientists began to reveal that some 2 to 3 miles down there appear to be dense layers of metal, which would explain why the craters were convex. But the most astonishing conclusion is that the only theory which can completely explain all the anomalies is that the moon is hollow, with a shell about 20 miles thick. So one of the other things was that if it's hollow, they found that it would seem like the actual force of gravity, depending on the thickness of that shell, is greater in some parts than in others. That was an interesting one. Moreover, the exhaust from when, let me see, the feeble rocket exhaust, which would not be caused by a vacuum, which is what NASA said. Oh, well, it's the vacuum because the moon is in a vacuum. Well, apparently it doesn't seem to be. It says the exhaust was apparently too weak to account for the necessary power to escape from such a gravitational pull in relationship to the size of the module, which was not large enough to contain the necessary fuel to escape the moon's high gravity. Was it anti-gravity propulsion secretly being used? What was it? Was this a simulation on Earth? It was trying to look at what the different ideas are, so that we can, I don't know, get some kind of an idea as to what is happening. So we're looking at here, the favoured theory is that the moon was formed by a collision of a large body with Earth. However, as already mentioned, the moon is the wrong size and in the wrong orbit. So in other words, it's either solid and in the wrong orbit, or it's in the right orbit and not what we think it is, that it's hollow. So it's a contradiction of terms, so it can't be both. So, and probably I'm getting far too boring on this right now, so I'm going to finish off. But anyway, what does not... Oh, that was the thing. Now this we all know that this is true, right? And it's not normal. It's not a natural phenomena. A more favoured was, however, as already mentioned, the moon is the wrong size and in the wrong orbit. It is too big and too far out. It does not rotate relative to the Earth. So, as the Earth rotates around, it rotates. Let me put it that way so you can see it rotating. That the Earth rotates around the moon, around the sun. Oh God, it must be getting late. What's the time? 9:30. I should be tucked up in bed. As it goes around, the Earth rotates on its own axis. It's turning and it's orbiting at the same time. This is the natural phenomena of things in orbit. And yet, what happens with the moon? it does not rotate relative to Earth. It has no spin on its own axis. Why doesn't it have a spin on its own axis? So that it can always show the same side to Earth, to us on Earth. It always shows this face. Now that in itself is pretty extraordinary. So, and what about the amazing coincidence, now this I thought was very interesting as well, of the eclipse phenomena, the position and the size of the moon and where it is, right, the position of where it is between, you have the sun and then you have the moon, and then here, right, you have the Earth. And the moon is in exactly the right position to bring about an eclipse, because obviously, as you look at it, if I show you something back here, right, I show you this, and then I demonstrate what happens when it approaches you. Alright, there we've got a Terence eclipse. Now, how would you gauge where the perfect place was to have that eclipse? Well, it has to be perfect. And it is perfect when the moon eclipses the sun. It's absolutely perfect. So that's something else that, because the math has to be perfect. So that's another thing as well. So what we're actually hoping for you to start thinking about is that not all things that we have been led to believe are the way that they are. We've got a moon, and that moon has a lot to answer for. It drives people crazy, especially if you're a vampire. It makes women's menstrual period change. It can alter the tides. It creates tides on planet Earth, which are not particularly, that ebb and flow of water being pulled by this body is not a natural phenomena. It's something that is brought about by the proximity of the moon to our planet. So there's an awful lot going on that we've always taken for granted. I always heard that, part of the folklore of Count Dracula was that if you see the full moon and you see it through a pane of glass and the window, oh boy, you're in dead trouble. So button up your collar, because strange stuff is going to happen on a full moon. And it is recorded, it's statistically recorded, that a lot of the bad behavior on planet Earth happens in full moons. Oh boy, we can blame it all on the moon. Okay, that's all from me, my little late night meandering. I hope you enjoyed it. It's about a subject that you may not have spent any time reading, and you might have spent even less time listening, in which case you won't be hearing me say this. Thanks for looking in. This is A Foreigner in the Philippines. Bye for now.